Dr. Atchison here. We're still talking about Chapter 4, Recognizing Visual Options. This is the second lecture talking about figure to ground organization. So figure to ground organization is kind of like a standard perception topic. In fact, most intro classes, this is the kind of perception that they're focusing on so you may be familiar with some of this figure to ground stuff, but we're going to hopefully go into some more depth so that you can understand this process a little bit better. So really what figure to ground organization is this process of assigning borders ownership. So is that border, does it belong to the thing? Or is it part of the background? What happens at this border? What's background? What's figure? So what is the figure versus what is the ground of the background? So this is done by edge extraction that we've talked about both in Chapter 3 and we talked about in the previous lecture. And this is, again, figuring out which border belongs to the thing we're looking at, the stapler, versus what belongs to the background, the wall the stapler may be leaning against. And typically it's pretty clear what owns that border. It's a border to something. And we can do this by a number of different ways that we'll talk about. So it's typically pretty clear, but when it's not, we have an ambiguous figure. And again, these are the things that people are most familiar with when we talk about figure to ground organization. So the most famous figure to ground organization picture is this one here. You could either see two faces or a vase. Or you can switch back and forth. And that's because it's ambiguous in terms of figure to ground. Is the figure the vase, a white vase on a black background? Or is it the figure two black silhouetted faces on a white background? So again, this is one of the most famous. There's definitely others. This was first discussed by Rubin, this kind of ambiguity. And again, this allows us to kind of look at this visual system principles and try to figure out how we're assigning the ownership of that border to object versus background. So how do we determine what is figure and what is ground? Especially in this example, we have three different views of the same scene. And the retinal image changes depending on your viewpoint. So if you're viewpoint A, you see the woman against a little bit of the picture, mostly though the wall and the ground. If your viewpoint is B, you see her mostly against, the top part of her is against the painting. That border will be assigned to her versus the painting of the ground, the wall, and then the ground itself. And if you're from angle C, you're going to see a different borders against different backgrounds. So again, in all three of these, the woman is against the ground of the painting, the wall, the floor, and the painting is a figure too. So we have both the painting as a figure and a woman as a figure. But in B, the woman is on top of the painting, which is on top of the background. So we have a lot of different figures and a lot of different grounds. And how do we determine what is figure and what is ground? So why do we perceive these images differently? Okay, on A, it looks like ink has maybe spilled on top of a series of B's. There looks like there's 5 letter B's, and there's this image on top of it, whether it's ink, whether it's who knows what, is on top of it. But we can perceive the B's underneath. Now, those shapes of the B's are the exact same shapes we see in B, except there, the image on top of it is white. And we don't perceive that as an image on top then. We're not seeing that. And this is because of the differences on how figure to ground organization is done. There's several principles that we're going to go through now that will kind of explain why we see the images of B's in A, and we have to look a lot harder to see them in B. I can see them in B because I know that they're there and I know that they're the same. But when I first look at it, that's not what I see. When I first look at it, I see a series of irregular shapes. And again, that has to do with these principles about assigning border ownership. So these are the principles that we typically use: depth, surroundedness, symmetry, convexity, meaningfulness, and simplicity. And we'll go through each of these in more detail. So the first one is depth. So here in our image of the bees, depth occurs when one image is perceived on top of another. One region is perceived on top. So here on A, that black ink is perceived on top of those bees, and so we can see the bees. The front region owns that border and is perceived as the figure. Here we would say that there's two figures. There's the depth of the ink on top of the bees, which is on top of a white background. Where in image B, we don't see that because it looks like gray irregular shapes on top of a white background. And again, that other region is perceived as the ground. So in B, we really only have figure and ground. In A, we have two figures and ground. Another principle is surroundedness. So when you look at this image, do you see a gray cloud on a black background? Then you're going to perceive the borders between the gray and the black as belonging to the cloud. You're going to say that because it is that gray cloud on top of that black background, that those borders where the gray and black meet belong to the cloud. But if you say that no, this is a black image on top of a gray background that has a cutout in the center of it, you're going to say that those edges belong to the black background. And again, that's on top of that gray surface. Another one of these is symmetry. And this is that regions that exhibit symmetry are more likely to be seen as a figure than non-symmetrical regions. Okay, the image in A contains two symmetrical regions, and those are shown in B. Okay, so kind of those candlestick shapes that are shown in B are those symmetrical images that we see in A. And again, those are what I see as the figure. And I see those figures against the white background. However, there's also three non-symmetrical regions in image A. And we don't see those necessarily as the images, one of which we see in C. So that space between those kind of two candlesticky shapes, we don't typically see that as the image, as the figure. We typically see that as the ground. And that's because of that process of symmetry. We're more likely to see these candlestick-like things as the figure because they're symmetrical. Whereas we're not as likely to see the space between those as the figure because they're non-symmetrical. Again, we're going to be more likely to attribute the figure to the thing that's symmetrical. The next one we have is that regions with convex borders are more likely to be perceived as the figure than ones with concave borders. So in this image here, you're more likely to see kind of twisty ropes than you are to see kind of branches with thorns. When I first looked at this image, I was like, branches with thorns? What are you talking about? Because for me, those convex borders were so strong that I had to really kind of focus on that space in between those twisty cords to see the branches with thorns. And even then, I still see that more as the background than I do as the figure. And that's because of this perception of that we're going to kind of, in an ambiguous situation such as this, we're going to side with the convex borders rather than the concave borders. Another one that we have is meaningfulness. And there's a launchpad exercise on this that's assigned for a class assignment this week. And it's really, really helpful, but it'll walk you through this. But we're more likely to perceive a figure as something that's meaningful. So in A, I'm more likely to say that the white area is the figure because it looks like half of a pineapple than I am to do that in the inverse version below where it no longer looks as pineapple-like. The same thing with C. I'm more likely to say that the white area is the image in C than I am in that inverted one, because it no longer looks like half of a person. So the meaningfulness, if it matches something that we already kind of perceive as an object, that matches those representations that we have in memory, then we're more likely to perceive that as the figure. And again, that Launchpad assignment is for a grade. The final principle we're going to talk about in figure to ground organization is simplicity. And this is the idea that the visual system is biased towards the simplest solution. So if it's given a choice between a complex solution, a complex perception of something versus a simpler perception, it's going to pick the simpler one every time. So in image A, we're more likely to perceive it that it's three objects, a red background with a blue line and a light blue line on top of that, because that is the simplest explanation. We're not as likely to say that it's going to be something way more complex. There are an infinite number of possibilities for what that could be. It could be 4 rectangles, it could be all 4 red rectangles and then the 2 lines, or 4 red rectangles and then 1 light blue line and 2 dark blue lines. It could be any of these different combinations. But again, our visual system is going to be biased towards that simple solution. So technically, A could be a combination of the images presented in C. But that's not a simple answer. I doubt any of you, when you looked at A, said, you know what I think it is? I think it is a series of irregular shapes of light and blue against 4 irregular rectangles. No, nobody said that, because of this principle of simplicity in figure to ground organization. If you're wondering how those images line up to look like A, that is the image presented in D. So you can kind of see how they line those different images up to get the perception that you see in A. So this ends our conversation about figure to ground organization. And I will see you in the next lecture to talk about perceptual grouping.